Welcome back, friends.
Welcome back.
It's time for an episode of the Strange and Beautiful Book Club. We're going to be talking about World War Z.
The book.
The book by Max Brooks. If you have seen World War Z, the movie, and you figure you can probably listen to this because you know all the spoilers already, don't.
You're
Stop.
wrong.
You're wrong. Because the book and the movie share exactly one thing.
The title.
The title. So stop what you're doing and go read the book. Listen to the audiobook, in fact, because it's a graphic audiobook and it's pretty fucking cool.
A star-spangled cast.
It is. It's got Mark Hamill. It's got Nathan Fillion. Every once in a while I'll be watching a movie and somebody from the graphic audiobook will pop up and I'll be like, oh,
I recognize them.
they're in World War Z. It has 7 of 9.
Yep.
Whose name I just lost. 7 of 9.
Jerry Ryan.
Jerry.
Ryan.
Okay. Yeah. 7 of 9. Yeah. Really good. Just excellent. And the book is excellent. So stop. Go read it. You don't want me to spoil it. There's a lot of really good. And you know what's really good about this book is it really pulls you through. You get the sense of a plot, but it does not have a plot. It is all like narrative exposition. It's interview style.
Yes.
It's an interview book about the end of the zombie apocalypse.
You were watching My Love from the Stars.
Yes.
And
Which is a K-drama.
A K-drama.
Uh-huh.
But they have this mechanic that they use where they have the main character being interviewed by somebody.
Right.
We never find out who.
No.
It doesn't matter. The entire purpose is for him to, in an organic way, do an info dump.
Yeah.
Explaining his background and the whole world and whatever.
And it works super effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because he's not telling us like an overarching story.
Right.
He's just telling anecdotes or explaining something.
Right. And that's what this entire
And that's
book is.
exactly what World War Z does.
And it's broken up into sections. And it really kind of, the amount of thought work that Max Brooks put into this is unreal.
It's astounding.
It's astounding.
Just how smoothly everything works and how comprehensive
Yeah.
the stories were.
And there is no part in it where I'm like, that's unrealistic. That's unrealistic. I'm like, yes, thank you.
When I think back about the stories in this book, I imagine the hours and hours and hours that he probably spent figuring out who to talk to.
Yeah.
And who those experts would be.
Right.
And then all the time actually interviewing them.
Right. I mean, he talks to, we get a political perspective. We get a military perspective. We get a social perspective. We get a
from
businessman's
multiple different
perspective.
countries and cultures.
Yeah. Not just like, here's how the zombie war went down in America. In fact, we spend very little time in America. I think the soldier, who is played by Mark Hamill, is the only like consistent American character.
There's the female fighter, the female pilot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think
but
there's only two
there's
or
only
three
a couple
Americans.
of characters that we talk to more than once.
Oh, yeah.
And Mark Hamill's character is one of them. And he's the soldier. And he has a section in each chunk because we're kind of following.
It's kind of 3 acts.
Yeah, it's really 3 acts. It's like the beginning, which is literally the beginning. And it's like literally the way that it started. This was written pre-pandemic. And it was basically a primer for how the beginning of the pandemic went. Yes.
Yeah.
Where I remember seeing an article that was like, oh, there's this new kind of cold that is showing up in airports in China. But don't worry, people with it are not being allowed to get on the plane. It's never coming here. You're like, oh, okay. Well, no, it's just a cold. Who cares? Right? That's fine. And then all of a sudden, oh, there's a case. It just showed up. But don't worry. It's just a cold. It's not going to go anywhere. So at the very beginning, we find out that there were these rumors of this thing called African rabies. And the reason it's called African rabies is because the first reports of outbreaks are in Africa, but it's actually been happening in China for a long time.
A while.
And we talked to a high up in the Israeli government. Jürgen Wormbrunn. I have it right here. Jürgen Rombrun, and he's talking about like, yeah, we knew stuff was happening in China because we cracked their code, we followed their code, but they were literally talking about like people coming back from the dead and shit. So we just figured it was a second layer of code. But this is a concept that sticks with me. That's why I mentioned this guy specifically, is he talks about how the 10th man, if 9 out of 10 people agree,
Right.
it's the
I
duty.
forget what the specific event was that happened in like Israeli history that he mentions.
Yeah, it's some kind of invasion where they were like, no, that will never happen. We'll never have that invasion.
But then it happened. And
Right.
so they decided if 9 or if all 10 experts agree, like unanimously, that a thing is going to happen, they pick one person
To disagree.
and that person has to disagree.
Yeah.
And try to find the holes in the logic.
You dig.
To try to find a rebuttal.
Yeah, to prove the other 9 wrong.
To prove the other 9 wrong.
Right.
And that's their job.
Right.
And so he was the 10th man on the, no, it can't be, the undead rising or whatever. So then it's his job to prove that it actually is. And he just keeps finding more and more evidence.
Right. And then he meets another friend, Paul Knight, I think. And they actually have the same report and they go over it together. They read it all night and they realize that they're right.
Yeah, they share notes.
Right. That this is actually happening. And this is when we create our first report. And we reference this report throughout, and it's the Warm Knight report. And it's like they detailed a way to prevent this outbreak from happening. Like if we act right now, if we quarantine the infected, we can let it die out. We can minimize casualties. We can be done with it. But nobody believes them because the premise is so ridiculous. People coming back from the dead? What do you mean? People coming back from the dead.
That can't happen.
Right. And we go from him, and we talked to a couple other people who are military. We talked to a CIA officer, Bob Archer, and he's the head of the CIA. And he's the one who's like, when you think about the CIA, you probably imagine 2 of our most popular and enduring myths. The first is that our mission is to search the globe for any conceivable threat to the United States. And the second is that we have the power to perform the first.
I love this meta commentary on the CIA.
Yeah.
From within the CIA.
Yeah, he's basically like, look, we did our best, but we aren't all powerful like you think we are. Just because we're secretive doesn't mean we know everything.
Right. And just because we've cultivated this reputation as just another lever of power.
Right.
Almost to reduce the amount of work that they have to do. Feels very realistic.
Right. And because he's asking everybody, well, didn't you know about it? Like other governments were finding out about it. Didn't you find about it? Because it's all, interviews. So you literally see the question and the answer. And this is the guy who's like, well, yeah, we did. But we don't have the resources. We didn't have the resources to fully to do everything because Americans don't like covert operations. We like the blitzkrieg smackdown. I think I've referenced that in a previous podcast. He's like, Americans don't feel like they've won if we don't blow shit up. If we don't have the big,
the
fourth
win
quarter
needs
touchdown.
to be so overwhelmingly no contest.
Right.
To be successful if it's, only a 95% survival rate.
Right.
Then we lost.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really fascinating because he's also talking about we're a volunteer army. We have to shepherd our volunteers. We have to cultivate our nationalistic spirit. And when it's gone, and we had squandered it. We had used he calls them brush fire wars, but he's referencing Afghanistan, where we literally went over there and we did good things, but we did a lot of not great things, and a lot of not great things got a lot of publicity. And so we didn't have the nationalistic spirit we needed to be able to raise the army necessary to react immediately to this situation. And so we didn't because we just couldn't, which I can completely see happening. And we also talked to, like, one of my favorite characters from the opening, the blame section, the beginning section, is the the drug rep guy.
Oh yeah, the pharmaceutical guy.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical guy who lives in Breckenridge Breck Scott.
Which I'm pretty sure that's Steve Buscemi.
It might. I don't know who does it, but he lives in Vostok Station, and
Okay.
it's like in Antarctica, and
Yes.
he's literally renting it from the Russians because he can't go anywhere because he's
so hated. Yeah.
Because he was like, "Well, I didn't call it rabies. I made a cure for rabies.
Yeah.
You're welcome."
They called it rabies. I made a vaccine for rabies.
Yeah, I don't know what your problem is. Like, it's basically like, yeah, I made a ton of money. No, I don't care about the consequences, but if there's a hell, well, that's probably where I'm going. Because he literally can't go anywhere. Because when they called it African rabies, all of these people jumped on the pile. He said we had a cure for like rabies in record time. And then everybody is on phalanx, which we talk about phalanx multiple times throughout the book, which is another thing I love
referenced.
that Max Brooks does, is he'll create these elements and he does not discard them. They just become part of the tapestry of this whole world that he's creating. Because we also talked to that lady who's like an architect. She's a city planner. And she's talking about how, like, yeah, I was worried about zombies, but I was also worried about, like, my husband's boat he was spending too much money on, and my daughter wasn't doing great in school, and the medication she needed wasn't great. And like, yeah, I had lots of other things to worry about. So I didn't worry about it. Plus we were all on phalanx. So who cares? Like we were all
We would have been
protected.
fine.
Peace of phalanx, peace of mind
Yep.
is what she says. And you're like, wow. The fact that he thought through like the initial military, like if we had reacted immediately and decisively, we could have ended this, but we didn't because here's the following reasons, which all make sense. And then like, yes, American businessmen would absolutely jump at the chance to defraud the public. Yeah.
Opportunity.
Right. And they're like, well, what do you talk about? You know, what do you think about people who didn't run because they thought they were protected? And he's like, I didn't tell them that they were protected from being a zombie. I didn't say that. They just insinuated that all on their own. That's not my problem.
Right. All the paperwork just says rabies, and it is an effective vaccine against rabies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. The plausible deniability or the avoidance of responsibility.
Yeah. It's really watching the whole first section build is really fascinating. Like we talked to the Russian lady who's the one who's voiced by 7 of 9, and she talks about like they were isolated and they were deliberately isolated. They couldn't call out. The Russians deliberately kept them like sequestered, and they ended up rebelling. But they weren't the only group that rebelled. A whole bunch of other groups did at the same time, and so they did the decimation.
Which this is only the second book that I've ever read that makes an explicit definition of decimation as 1/10.
Yeah, they have to reduce the army by 1/10, and they have to pick. They break them up into
Right.
groups.
It's specifically
10.
in the rebelling groups.
Yeah.
The rebelling groups have to pick 1 out of every 10 people have to die.
Yep.
And they have to be killed by the members of their group.
Right. So they literally break them all up into groups of 10, and they have to choose which of them's going to die, and then they have to kill them with rocks. They literally bring them rocks to beat them to death with. And she's the one who says, "We relinquished our freedom that day, and we were more than happy to see it go. From that moment on, we lived in true freedom, the freedom to point to someone else and say, 'They told me to do it. It's their fault, not mine.' The freedom, God help us, to say, 'I was only following orders.'"
Right.
He has some bangers in this. I highlighted quite a few lines in my copy of this book. We go immediately from there to the guy who is like private security for a celebrity. Because as this section builds, we go from there's isolated outbreaks that are happening, but nobody really knows where. There's no like firsthand experiences they're like anecdotal experiences to everyone is starting to have experiences because it's building to the point where it can't be hidden anymore, where literally there are actual zombies everywhere. And so we get to a point where there's such a huge outbreak, people are literally starting to like isolate themselves in their homes. And so they talk to that one guy who's like, he's a friend to all these celebrities. So he invites them all to his place, and he has like food and like steel doors and
Oh, yeah, and there's this giant compound with a fence and like explosives around the perimeter. It's this huge defensive compound.
right. And he's live streaming it. So he's
Yes.
live streaming them all there.
And so they're like, yeah, if the zombies come, we're fine. The zombies can't get over, they can't get through our defenses. But it's not the zombies who come.
Yeah.
It's the people, just regular people who are watching these live streams.
Yeah.
And like, holy shit, I can't believe they're flaunting this in our faces, that their previous, like, kind of lucking into wealth and fame has bought them all this protection.
Yeah.
And we're going to go, like,
Yeah, he's
take
live
'em down a
streaming like
notch.
this place is safe. This place is
And
has
they're just
food and water,
partying.
and they're just partying. So all of these civilians who are watching this live stream storm the castle. They all they're breaking down the door not to kill everybody, but to like get the women and children inside, protect them, like find a place to wait this out.
It's here, here's a safe place.
Yeah,
They're going to get in
right.
to get the safety. And yeah, that's totally like reasonable that would happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And this guy's the one that he just leaves. He's like, no, I'm not killing civilians for you.
He said, like, yeah, he specifically says, I got paid to shoot zombies,
Yeah.
not people.
Right. And then we move into kind of the first section is kind of our shortest section. The part where the outbreak is happening. We can't cover everybody that we talk to. That's why you just need to go read this book, because we talked to like an organ transplant guy who talks about how it probably spread through like the underground organ market out of China, because who knows how many infected kidneys got implanted in people.
Right. And he specifically mentions
He's like,
that would
kidneys,
totally
corneas.
explain why you had all these reports of people just turning into zombies without getting bitten.
Right, because they had gotten like an illegal organ and it was in there, and it may have been small enough that it took a week, 2 weeks. If it was infected, it was enough, but that didn't mean it wouldn't take a while to happen.
Right.
And then we talked to the guy who used to transport people. Like you'd get bribed.
Like a smuggler.
Like a
Yeah.
smuggler to try to bribe people. Normally it was like slaves, but then all of a sudden it was people trying to get their infected family members out, because at the time there was no understanding of what it meant that these people were actually dead. And we talked to a fellow, like a Chinese doctor, who goes out to a rural village and finds that this boy has been infected. And that's the one where everything's going to be all right. That one, the guy where he's like, he calls a friend in the ministry and he's like, hey, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. But his friend is so morose and they've gone through so much together. He knows that means like shit's going down. And then we move from there to like, okay, shit has gone down. It is full outbreak, pandemonium. If we don't do something soon, this is it for the human race. And this is when we meet. There's 2 sections that I think about a lot in this book, and this is one of them. We meet. Forget what they actually say his name is. This is his Jolalawa Azania. XOLELWAAZANIA. Azania.
Okay.
And he meets him. He's like at a desk, and he's like, "Oh no, you sit down. Come here. Come. I'm writing the memoirs of Paul Redeker."
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so he talks about Paul Redeker, this South African man who'd been shaped during apartheid. And he had created this plan to get, like, to save the white Afrikaners in case there was ever a uprising. And now, I mean, there's an uprising, but of the dead. And so the South African government seeks him out. And they're like, do you have a plan for this? And he does. And he
Because regardless of how unethical this guy was,
Yeah.
And his plans
He
were.
wasn't unethical. He was just completely logical. Like logic free from
Well,
reason.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Some of it was unethical.
I mean, it's unethical.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's
ethics
super
didn't enter
logical.
into the decisions. Yes.
But it's super effective.
right.
And so he has this reputation for just like brutal, effective planning, kind of throwing away all human sentimentality
Yeah.
as a consideration. And so they're like, we have our top people on this, but you remember that guy? That
Yeah.
guy's name that we don't say anymore because it's so like politically contentious to have any links to him. Yeah, we need him.
Yeah, we need him. And so they
We
go
need his spin on this.
and he's expecting them to come and kill him, but they've come to find out what his plan was, because of course he's made a plan.
Because he is always making a plan.
Because he's always making a plan, and he does, and it's the Redeker plan. And basically, it's like, sorry, but we can't save them all. The time for saving everybody is past, and it's just now. How can we save anyone? And so you literally
Right. What's
designate
a plan
Yeah.
that we can follow that has a high certainty of saving some?
some, but you
And
can never
basically,
save
it's
all.
you tell everybody that you go to these safe zones, but most of the safe zones are bait zones.
Bait. Yep. Yes. There's only one safe zone basically per you designate a safe zone, you wall it off, everyone in it, that's who survives. And everybody else has a purpose or doesn't have a purpose.
You strategically expose the other quote safe zones
Yeah.
to distract the zombie swarms.
Right. So that you can save the people in your actual safe zone. And yeah. And so he goes and says it in front of the South African government. And they're all like, oh my fucking God. Because he's literally like, yeah, you just leave those people to die. Better yet, you get them to run in the opposite direction. So they're taking all the zombies with them. And then you just leave them.
And it's so controversial that they're like, hell no.
Oh, no, we won't do that. But then,
They do it.
The elder statesman, who isn't Mandela. Yes, thank you.
It's absolutely not.
It's absolutely not. And at all, that guy.
It's just the elder statesman of South Africa.
Right. He gets up and gives him a hug, and he's like, you will save us. And the guy goes, that was the last anyone ever saw of Paul Redeker. And we don't know what happened to him. It's possible that his heart broke that day.
They just talk
or
about
whatever.
how he disappeared and how like his upbringing may have like traumatized him, and his whole like hyper logical way of solving problems was a like trauma response to his upbringing and whatever. And then as he's like leaving the building, he has to sign out from visiting the psychiatric institution, and the room was Paul Redeker.
Yeah, because that was Paul, but Paul just couldn't handle it.
And Paul has completely disassociated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we go into each country working through their version of the Redeker plan.
Yeah, and pretty much every country institutes some form of the Redeker plan.
Right. And one of my favorites is when we talk to the German guy. And I think about this one. There's a couple that I think about a lot, and this is definitely one of them, because he talks about the difference between East Germany and West Germany, and how East Germans were taught like a victim mentality. They were taught like, this is being done to you. You are being oppressed. This is happening to you. Where in the West, it was more like, you have to shoulder the burden of what you have done, of what you allowed to happen. That's on you. Personal responsibility, no matter what, even if you're wearing a uniform, your personal responsibility comes before anything else. You cannot say, I was just following orders. But then he gets the order to leave. They've been defending this civilian town, and they get a code, like a retreat code, but it's in a coded military channel, not in an open channel like it has been, because they've been leaving it open so that public knows where the military is going to be so they can retreat as the military does.
Right, because the zombie apocalypse is a completely different like military conflict landscape. You don't have to
Yeah.
worry about the enemy listening in on you.
Right.
So all of the kind of advanced technological stuff you can throw away.
Right. Yeah. We talk about that too because we cover fucking everything. But literally, they're like, okay, you guys are going to retreat to this specific coordinates, but don't tell anybody, okay? And he won't do it. He almost doesn't do it. And he's like, well, then your entire unit is going to die. So you decide, do all the people with you die or do you do what you're told to do? And so he ends up leaving, but he leaves knowing like, I'm going to go find this general that gave me that order and I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him because he made me, he gave the order to basically let these people die. And I can't let that stand. But the guy shoots himself before he can kill him. And we get this line where he says, he's like, I couldn't have hated him more for killing himself. Even if I had killed him, it would have been better than him killing himself. And he's like, why? The interviewer is like, did this not make you feel any kind of sympathy for him? And he's like, fuck no. He goes, he saw the road ahead, a steep, treacherous mountain road. We'd all have to hike that road, each of us, dragging the boulder of what we'd done behind us. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't shoulder the weight. All right, Max. That's a good one, too, because, it's like these people had to make hard decisions. The people that were involved in the military group had to make hard decisions. Any military group.
And the generals were imposing all of this potentially, I don't know, conflicting behavior against their morals.
Yeah.
And then the things that the general had asked their subordinates to do when the time came, their subordinates had all followed through on the like immoral orders, but then when it came time for him to handle it, he couldn't do the same level of discipline.
Yeah.
Moral discipline, I
Right.
guess, that his soldiers were able to follow through on.
Yeah.
And so he committed suicide.
Yeah. You know what I like about this book, I think, is it's a good post-apocalyptic book. It's a good, like, end of the world, basically, end of the civilization as we know it book, in which we never once fall back on the trope of the single nasty-ass dude who runs his little town and keeps the protagonist from being able to do what they want to do. In fact, we meta make fun of that towards the end.
We completely avoid all of the tempting, cheap conflict
tropes
in the typical like zombie horror movie.
Right. We even talked to the president of the United States. We don't talk to him, but we talk to his vice president, who is definitely not Biden. And they call him the wacko. He's like, that's okay. Yeah. Everybody calls me that. It's fine. But he's the one who's like, he did exactly what he needed to do. He literally still held elections, even after we had to abandon the capital and retreat to Honolulu, because America wanted a Caesar. But if he had become one, that would have meant the end of America. And he says, this is the only time for high ideals. Because they were like, you shouldn't have high ideals right now. This is a war. And he's like, no, this is the only time for high ideals because those ideals are all we have. We aren't just fighting for our physical survival, but for the survival of our civilization. We don't have the luxury of old world pillars. We don't have a common heritage. We don't have a millennia of history. All we have are the dreams and promises that bind us together. All we have is what we want to be.
Yeah, that line hit me.
Yeah. You're like, oh, Jesus. Okay. Yeah. And this book really could have easily fallen back on the like, well, the leaders did a shitty job. They made shitty decisions and then the people had to save us. But it's like, yes, at the beginning, a lot of decisions were made that were bad decisions. Like we talk about Yonkers. They're going to defeat the zombies at Yonkers. So they're going to Zed heads, I think is what they call them. So we're going to fire tanks at them and light them up and blow them up or whatever. And this is one of the ones where we talked to Mark Hamill's character. And he's like, yeah, that was all based on how you fight people. But we weren't fighting people. You can't intimidate Zach into turning around. They're never going to get scared. They're never going to stop. And every one of us that falls to them now is an enemy we have to fight. They're never going to get hungry. They're never going to get tired.
Right. So it's all these military leaders that have become dependent on all this technology that they are proud of, that they kind of force the soldiers to use, that in human on human army conflicts is very effective, but it's not against an unthinking swarm.
Right.
And all of the things that, like, a lot of the weapons are designed to maim the enemy.
Yeah.
Well, when you maim a zombie, you don't kill it. You just make it, like, lay on the ground and crawl in such a way that it's really hard for your soldiers to notice.
Right.
And then, oops, they grab you, knock you down, and infect your soldiers, who then become their soldiers.
Their soldiers. Yeah. I don't know if great times make great men, but I know they can kill them. That's another one from the wackos section. Yeah, and we talk about, once we do have our safe zones, we talk about people that were outside the safe zones and people that were in it, because we talked to that one lady who remembers fleeing north. They were told to flee north, and so she goes with her family.
Oh, because
north.
the zombies freeze solid.
Yeah, because zombies freeze solid in the winter. If you can get far enough north, you'll be safe. But really, they were trying to get people to run north to keep them from running towards the safe zone.
Right.
To keep them from following.
These were the bait.
Yeah.
To keep the safe zones safer.
Right. And we talk about, like, they had to resort to cannibalism, because she says, it's the irresponsible part wasn't that they told us to run north. It's that they didn't give us any kind of useful information. It wasn't like, here's the kind of stuff you need to take. Here's the kind of way you need to dress. Here's what you need to do. It's like, no, you just go. You flee north. Just flee north. Flee north. And she's the one who's working in, I think, like, Canada, clearing zombies out at the end of the winter. She's got like a hatchet, and she's just walking along talking and hatcheting zombies in the head because they're frozen into the snow.
Yeah.
And that's the one where there's like a SpongeBob sleeping bag and a DVD player and a GameCube or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's a couple
all
dated,
these things that
a couple dated references. That's one of them.
All of these treasured belongings that people brought with them when they fled north that were completely useless for survival.
Right. And as time goes on, we talk to more and more interesting people. We talk to, like, astronauts that got trapped on the International Space Station and end up helping keep satellites in orbit so that people could keep communicating.
Right. So all the communication satellites, the GPS satellites, everything just keeps running.
Yeah. And I think another thing that makes his world feel super big without having to give us too much exposition is he'll just drop names. He's like, we saw the Battle of New Delhi or whatever, where, don't believe what they tell you about General Raj Singh. He didn't leave his men. I saw the whole thing. He had to be knocked out and loaded onto that chopper. Well, we never find out about that battle. I mean, we see the general again, but we don't know what happened.
Right. The just, like, side references to specific events I love it as a technique of world building.
Right. Yeah, it's assuming knowledge in the reader or in the...
Right, and so you just have to pull that in and, like, scaffold it into your context of what's going on, and you end up with this very sparsely populated scaffold.
Yeah.
But it's a humongous scaffold.
Right.
And then the writer only has to provide you, little bits and pieces, just kind of spread around very evenly.
We talked to the guy who wanted to go to North Korea because everyone in North Korea just disappears. And we don't clear that shit up. We don't talk about where they went. We don't talk about how they're going to go over there and find out. Nothing. And then we talked to that guy who's making movies, because literally one of the things that's affecting everyone, even though they're now in the safe zone and the safe zones have been cleared, well, people are literally going to bed and not waking up in the morning. They're just dying of despair. And so this guy sets off to make like a movie.
I think he starts off more hired as like a propaganda guy.
Yeah.
And they're like, we need you to make films just to like keep up morale, whatever. But he
he doesn't get hired to do the movies, because remember, we've already talked about de-stress. So we talked about like when everybody went into the safe zone, all of the people whose jobs were like white collar behind the desk doing computer stuff were now useless. We needed cleaners, we needed people who could cut apart cars, we needed gardeners, farmers, livestock people, all of that. We didn't need the like executives and the whatever. So it literally flipped society. So all of the people who are like blue collar workers.
That's right. Yeah, there's references to like the one lady that keeps calling her like
teacher,
her trainer.
Yeah, Magda,
because Magda used to be her housekeeper.
Right.
But now Magda is the subject matter expert on specific survival or like maintenance techniques.
Yeah.
And now this lady has to learn them from Magda.
Right. And so we've talked about that. And so we've kind of established that like the kinds of things that we consider part of like television and movies and things are no longer essential, because if you can't eat, who cares if you can produce a television show? And so he had to try to get the resources to make the movies, and he couldn't. So he ended up doing it by himself. He just took a handy cam and went around and filmed, and then he cut it all together himself and released the first copy.
I thought it was kind of like the narrator.
No,
where he was employed to do that.
Right. No, once they realized that it was actually having a positive effect, like cases of people going to bed and not waking up in the morning had significantly dropped. Then they were like, okay, we see the point. And that's when he got the resources to do the bigger movies.
Okay.
And I
remember like people were just lined up to just watch his movie on repeat.
Yeah. And he says, I chose to show the other side, the one that gets people out of bed the next morning, makes them scratch and scrape and fight for their lives because someone is telling them that they're going to be okay. And there's a word for that kind of lie: hope.
Yep, that's why. So that reminds me of this line from Discworld, Terry Pratchett's Discworld, where Death is having a conversation with this woman. And she says, you're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable? And he says, really, as if it was some kind of pink pill? No, humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies, hogfathers, little... Yes, as practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies so that we can believe the big ones. Yes, justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing.
That's a good one.
And so this filmmaker,
yeah,
he knows that people need a narrative to lay over the world.
Right.
So that it seems like it makes sense. And then when it seems like it makes sense and they actually act on that, it actually does make sense.
Right. Yeah, he talks about that. He's like, we had all these big, flashy weapons that were absolutely shit at taking out zombies, but they looked super cool, and that's what people needed. They needed like, oh, we can take this. We can handle this. We have the technical prowess to be able to do this, even though this single point laser system that can kill one zombie isn't going to make that. What do they call the ratio? Because they make up that de-stress ratio. That's like the resource to kill ratio.
Yeah.
And it's how much resources does it take per kill?
Right. And it ends up being like 99.9% of the actual zombie kills come from soldiers with just old school rifles.
Yeah, that, and they have the Lobo, the lobotomizer.
Yes.
It's like a shovel, axe, pick combo.
And I remember when I first read this book, I learned about the fact that the Marines are part of the Navy, but they don't really get funding from the Navy. And I looked into it a little bit.
Yeah.
I Googled around, and yeah, basically the Marines have to expense everything through the Navy, but then the Navy doesn't put a lot of priority on land forces,
Right.
obviously. And so a lot of Marine equipment is improvised.
Right. Yeah. It's the amount of thought work that went into this book, and then they made the movie,
And oh my gosh.
and then people are like, "Oh no, I didn't like the movie." And it's like, "No, you don't understand. This is like a treatise. This is like somebody wrote a PhD after we had a zombie apocalypse,
Yes.
detailing the history of what happened."
Which he has a separate book called The Zombie Survival Guide.
Yeah, and he has more stories. Like he has more stories that I haven't read, but yeah, I mean that's literally what this is. It's like somebody wrote a history of a history that never happened, but a completely believable history. And
Right. And so
Yeah.
many things that just like me, I'm good at making stuff up, just winging it, figuring things out as I go. And I read this book and I'm like, wow, I would not have thought of that.
yeah, we talk
I
about
would
like
not have considered
like,
this edge case.
there's the part where he's talking about the nuclear exchange and how everyone is expecting India and Pakistan to have a nuclear exchange. Like everyone
because they've such contentious
right, because the
enemies
tension
for
has
so
been there.
long.
And they're like, and that's why it didn't happen. Because we had the infrastructure to communicate with each other, because we have been at each other's throats for so long.
Right. All the global pressure has been on them
Yeah.
to make sure that they don't do it.
Right.
So that all the tools and procedures and training were in place so that when it came down to it, they were like, oh no, we've prepared for this.
Yeah. We've literally talked this out already.
It's
We
like
know
in
exactly
a
what to do.
crisis, you don't rise to your level of ability, you fall to your level of training.
Right. And that's exactly what happens. So the military exchange or the atomic exchange isn't between them. It's between two people that you never would have expected because they didn't have the infrastructure available to do it.
Right. They didn't have all that
To communicate.
foundation of prevention
Yeah.
in place.
And we talk about like once we get through the initial outbreak phase, we immediately go into the like panic, the great panic. And then we go into like safe zone, starting to like get everybody together. And then we go from there to cultural shift. Okay, we have safe zones. Everybody's in the safe zones. What do we do now? And that's the part where we talk about like the guy who's doing the videos and they're doing the training of people who otherwise don't have practical training. And then we talk to Cuba. And I love the Cuba section because the guy's like, Cuba won the zombie war. Like, it's just the facts. Cuba won the zombie war. It's like we had like one outbreak. We took care of it and we're done. Because we're an island nation. We're an isolated, like a deliberately long-term isolated island nation. We fucking won the zombie war. Like Cuba emerges as the power. Like,
Right. And for like literally generations, the populace has had to be vigilant against all kinds of things.
Right. He's like, we were prepared. We're great. We did great. Like, we took in refugees. We had a plan. We put them in camps. And if we maybe spread some rumors about people who, like, camps that rebelled that got fed to the zombies, meh. We didn't have to feed anybody to the zombies. We just had to spread the rumor. And then
They kept everybody in line.
Then they came up with the plan of, like, you can get out and you can work for credit to get other people out. And so he's like, the camps were drained in 10 months. We didn't even have to have refugee camps to support. Literally everybody came over and they all started
became
working.
a productive member of society.
Right. And he's like, we shared a bond after that. Like we came together as a country in a way we never could have come together otherwise. And he says, freedom isn't just something that you have for the sake of having. You have to want something else first. And then you want the freedom to fight for it.
Go, Max.
I know. He also talks about, like, Castro. What happens to Castro? And
Oh
he's
yeah, and
like,
Castro. Yeah,
step
this is
down.
like
So fucking good because he's like, he's like,
multiple levels of political intrigue just
Yes.
summarized in
a
oh
paragraph.
yeah,
Yeah, he's like,
and he did this.
He presided over he's like, the one thing that infected us that otherwise couldn't infect us was the idea of freedom. Because we brought all these people in from all of these countries where they didn't have Castro. They didn't have the type of government we had. And that's what infected us, was the desire for democracy. And instead of holding on to power, Castro facilitated and was the first one to vote himself out of office. And he's like, that's why his
And
legacy is a statue and not a bloodstain against a wall.
Right. He voted himself out of office, and he cemented his entire reputation as, I'm the one who brought democracy to Cuba.
Yes. Yes. He's like, yeah. And he literally says that's why his legacy is a statue and not a bloodstain against a wall. And he's like, oh, that sly bastard. God damn, Max Brooks, you really thought through everything. Because then we go from there to like, okay, what do we do now? And they have the Saratoga conference where they get all the leaders of all these countries together and they're like, okay, we've consolidated power. We've carved out a safe zone.
Oh, yeah. And it's initiated as, hey, we're going to try to start reinitiating trade between these, segments of countries that are surviving.
Yeah.
And they're beginning to recover a little bit. Like, you're above survival threshold. And, hey, maybe we can exchange some things. But then America comes in and is like, we're going all out offensive against the zombies. Yeah. And everybody's like, what the fuck?
They're like, what?
We're barely surviving.
It's like, yeah, exactly. That's it. We're barely surviving. And that's the legacy we can leave, a bare minimum survival. Or we can teach our children that we had the strength to take back the planet.
Right. This is the inflection point where now we can actually maintain our survival groups on top of actively fighting back.
Yeah. And he's like, we don't have to do it fast, but we need to do it. It's important. This is the difference between survival and death, because if we just have safe zones, eventually we're going to be overrun. This is going to come back. It's going to happen again. And we will not have the blueprint to fight. We will have given up. And so our children and their children's children will just give up like we did. So we have to go on the offensive. And so then we talk about how each different country goes on the offensive. And like America, we literally make a line of soldiers north to south and just walk. And it takes like 2 years to completely cross from one end to the other. And we also talked to the French guy. And this is when we talked to René Auberjois. And he's the one who's talking about cleaning Paris.
The sewers.
And this is another really good one because he's like, how long did it take to clear all of London? Like 3 years? Why did they throw us at Paris the way they did? It was ridiculous. There was no planning. We had no equipment. He's like, literally, the catacombs were a subterranean horror land. They were filled with zombies. There were no maps. We kept getting lost. You could fall into a pit of water and all of a sudden things were grabbing at your feet. And this is when he's like, on ne passe pas. Because he's talking about, I say that like a lot at home, so I felt like I needed to bring it up because I quote it a lot. And he's talking about like they got to this hospital that had been boarded up, like all the zombies had been closed in.
Oh yeah, it
and
was
that's
an old
where he lost
sanitarium.
that's where he lost his brother.
They were just throwing zombies in there just for containment.
Yeah.
But then they'd sent these crews in through the sewers and they were just clearing blocked passages, and they ended up clearing a blocked passage into the sanitarium, and then just thousands more zombies in the sewers.
Yeah, and he's like, they could have just blown the tunnel, backed up, left that for somebody else, but they decided to fight. One squad against 300 zombies, and they decided to fight. And he's like, and fucking why? And he's like, I don't want to hear about your war and how hard it was. You have no fucking idea. And I love the ones that he include that ultimately that doesn't further our story any, but it increases kind of the depth of the world. He's covering all these different, some people, like the United States, was slow and careful and methodical, and it took years to clear everything out. And some were just like, okay, now go do it. And it just drives home the point that just because everybody did it doesn't mean everybody did it well. Because otherwise, we have some pretty big heroes in this book. We have the president who ends up being a hero. We have, all these other characters that we talk to who end up being like a hero, like almost an unreal hero, like a Sheridan, like a Babylon 5 Sheridan level hero, where, but which is good. I like that. I do like that. It is not like bleak. Everybody was out for themselves. Some people were, like the guy, the Breckenridge Scott guy, but not everybody was. That there are people who will act selflessly. There are people who will act selfishly, and there are people who will act selflessly. And he included the whole spectrum. And then we talked to the military guy one more time, because he's talking about like the psychological effect of this march, this forced march across the United States. And he references his dad. Did you catch that? Max Brooks. Because Max Brooks' dad is...
Surprise!
Mel Brooks. Like Spaceballs Mel Brooks. Like Robin Hood Men in Tights Mel Brooks.
Like Blazing Saddles
Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks was also in this 1970s kids CD, or I guess album. And it's called Free to Be You and Me. Anyway, I'm a baby too. There's the part where they pick up the skulls and they're doing the...
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And that's
was
from that
an
album.
Homage to
that's from
his
that
father's
album, because Max Brooks is one of the voices of the babies. Mel Brooks is one of the voices of the babies. Hi, I'm a baby too. I used to play that for the kids.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was like, I see what you did there, Max. But
You probably heard that all the time growing up.
Yeah. And the other one that I love is the underwater zombies. I mean, of course, we aren't talking about everything that's happening in this book, because some of these are short, some of them are long. We talk about feral children.
The audiobook was 12 hours long.
Yeah, we talk about feral children. We talk about an escaped Chinese sub that has nuclear ordnance that they end up using in order to take China back from the government that refuses to relinquish control and just keeps throwing people at the zombies. Like, it's not building the zombie army and depleting theirs. But then we also talk to the guy who's tagging underwater zombie migration. Because by the end of it, we've taken back the surface of the planet effectively. But we have not wiped zombies out, because so many people became zombies and so many people went to the sea to try to avoid the zombie plague and ended up getting dumped off the side of ships, or ships sank, or whatever.
Right. So there's these underwater swarms
of zombies
at the bottom of the ocean that are basically dragged along with the ocean currents.
Well, they walk, they move around, and they don't know what causes them to move in any particular direction. And so this guy is not killing them, just tagging them so they can track their migration. And he's the one who's like, you know who really lost the zombie war? The whales. He's like,
because pretty much all the whales are dead.
Yeah, pretty much all aquatic, like, because they just they trample the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
Yeah.
Most of the macrofauna of the ocean are gone, because the zombies kill them.
And he's like, whatever, man, tell it to the whales.
The tell it to the whales line. Whew.
He's like, yeah, you want to talk about everything that we lost? Whatever, man. Tell it to the whales. You can't, because they're all gone. And just the idea that we go all the way from, hey, we had a couple of reports of this rabies that broke out, to it has literally become such a fabric thing in our planet that we're not even actively trying to kill them anymore. We're just trying to figure out what they're up to. Because we don't have the resources to destroy all of the zombies under the water. We just have to make sure we know where they're at. So when they do come ashore, we can take care of them there.
Yep.
Or we talk to the lady who's just walking along having a conversation and killing the zombies that are frozen into the ground. And there's places that we still haven't taken back because they're literally so infested. It's not worth it. Like Iceland or Greenland. They're like the hottest white zone. And it's just, anyway, it's a fascinating book. It's a fascinating exploration. There's not a wasted moment in the book. There's not a story that you don't feel advances
All
whatever.
the characters are engaging
Yeah.
and plausible.
Right. Even the ones we only see for a little while or we only see once, you still kind of are like, okay, like I really, and some of them have connections that you have to read the book 3 or 4 times to really understand. Like we talked to that otaku guy in Japan.
Was it Hitori? The people who are like so socially anxious that they like shut-ins,
He
lock-ins.
calls himself an otaku.
Right, and otaku is they're not the shut-ins.
Okay.
There's another like subgenre of I don't know. I guess technically mental illness. But it's like locked-ins, or something like that is the translation. But it's literally people who do not leave their room.
Okay.
And that's what he is. Because he's so like adapted to online society.
Right. That in face-to-face
And
communication.
face-to-face
is- yeah.
communication is completely off the table.
Yeah.
They can't even leave the room and talk to their parents. But they're dependent on their families.
Right.
And so, yeah, we talk about this otaku guy.
Yeah.
And it's like a couple weeks after the apocalypse, and he's finally like...
Well,
he's
the
been-
internet goes down.
He's been running out to get just uncooked ramen to eat.
Yeah.
And then one morning he wakes up and his computer cannot connect to the internet
Yeah.
because he's on a battery backup, but the internet's down. The
Right.
local network connections are down.
Right. And he's like, and so he ends up fleeing, but he gets a sword as part of his fleeing.
Yeah, he ends
And-
up in this apartment.
Right.
And he kind of makes note of a few references about the person that lived in that apartment,
Yes.
the owner of the sword.
Right. And it's heavily implied in the book, not in the audiobook because parts of the audiobook are abridged, but it's heavily implied in the book that the sword that he got is actually the sword of the brother of the blind fellow.
Blind gardener guy.
Yeah, the Hibakusha guy, survivor of the atomic bomb. And who, it's like his greatest shame in life that he never tried to contact his brother to tell him to flee. Well, we kind of find out what happened to his brother, sort of, because we talked to this guy. And you don't realize that until you've read it as many times as I've read it, which is a lot. But the graphic audiobook is so easily readable because all of the people that do it are fabulous. Everyone that they got to do it does a perfect job. We even talk about like the social fallout at the end. The fact that Russia becomes a religious city-state, like a religious state.
Right. The head of the government declares themselves the head of the church.
Right. They're the Holy Russian Empire now because they come up with this final sacrament, which is they were trying to fight with ordinance that was ancient. And so a lot of these children were dying. A lot of the soldiers were children, and a lot of them were getting infected. And the only thing you could do once you were infected was kill yourself. So every time they would go out for a mission and come back, they'd have a whole group of them that had to kill themselves.
And they kind of just said, okay, take care of yourselves.
Yeah.
We're not going to be involved. You just better be dead when we come back. We'll
Right.
clean up your bodies.
And so this one priest was like, nope, no more souls lost to hell because they have to commit suicide. And
it becomes the church's responsibility.
to kill these kids.
The priests become the kind of mercy killers.
Yeah. And they're like, okay, well, what about reports of people using this as a way to like kill off political rivals and stuff? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
I have to go now.
I have to go now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. So if you've seen the movie and you think you think you know what World War Z is all about, incorrect. Go and read the book. It is my favorite zombie book, hands down. Hands down. No competition. I have never read another zombie book like it. I don't think I've ever read another book like it.
No.
With just the level of detail and thought that went into it and the way it's completely readable. If you tried to write this out as a story, like a a plot novel with this many characters in it, it wouldn't work.
Spanning that amount of time, because it spans like 12 years.
It would feel clunky.
Right. In this book, there are no like explicit like guided plot beats.
Yeah.
It's all just very elegantly implied.
Yes.
Through the sequence of anecdotes from the interviewees.
Right. And it's just so deftly done. It doesn't even feel like you're reading as much information as you are.
Right. It feels more like an anthology.
Yeah.
Except the anthology kind of threads this line through 12 years of kind of historical journaling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 10 out of 10 would read again, have read again and again and again. Audiobook, check. Get the audiobook. Book, check. Get the book, because the book is not abridged. So if you want to get every single tiny little morsel of information out of it, I highly recommend you read the book too.
Yeah, it's probably, the audiobook is probably like 96%
yeah,
of
the
full book.
abridgment is extremely small. But there are just a couple of like paragraphs and lines that I know they cut out because I've listened to the audiobook so many times. And some of them do add a little bit of meaning, but they don't taking them out didn't take away from the context of the novel. So you get the full picture. You just don't get all the tiny little details. Yeah. We have never done like a just standalone book podcast. I'm not sure how we will wrap it up. Do we need a rating system of some kind?
Yeah, I guess this would be our first published Rachel Matt book episode.
Yeah. Normally with Kate and I, we just talk about it, and then when it winds up, we wind up. So I guess we can just leave it here. Go check the book out. You should have read it already. I'm sorry. But you know what? Honestly, we didn't spoil that much. There's so much more in it.
There really is.
Yeah. There's absolutely no way we could talk about all
and
of it.
so much of it is the conveyance of the story rather than the content of the story.
Right. Yeah, and the way he nailed all those individual voices.
Right.
Every single one of those characters has to have an individual voice. And some of the stuff that he comes up with, some of the lines and the concepts I just read a couple of quotes, but there are some really, really thought-provoking lines in there.
So remember, sometimes the strangest things are the most beautiful too.
So be who you are and love what you love. Until next time, friends.
Bye.
And don't love the World War Z movie. Well, you can if you want to. That's part of our shtick. But love the book more.